stack of invitations trembled in Ethan Miller's small hands as he gripped his crutches tighter. Each movement down the school hallway a practice rhythm of metal and muscle. At 7 years old, he had learned to balance the weight of his body with the aluminum supports. Each click against the tile a reminder of the cerebral palsy that shaped his days. He didn't think of himself as broken, not usually, but today was different. Today, he was carrying his hopes on glossy cardstock, invitations with holographic fish that shimmered like they were swimming whenever the paper tilted. In the light, his father had said they were special, just like you, and Ethan had believed him. The hallway buzzed with the wild energy of children released between classes. Laughter and footsteps echoing as backpacks swung carelessly. Ethan spotted Jake Perkins, the boy everyone seemed to follow, the one whose birthday parties were always filled with balloons, and classmates jostling to be near him. Ethan's heart thudded as he maneuvered closer, holding out an invitation, like it was a ticket to something magical. "I'm having a birthday party this Saturday," he said, voice small but steady. Jake's eyes flicked downward, lingered on the crutches, then returned to Ethan's face with a look that wasn't cruel, but wasn't kind either. He said nothing, just turned and walked away, the space between them closing with indifference. Ethan's hand hung there, invitation trembling until he slowly lowered it. He tried again with Madison Taylor, the girl whose party he had attended just a month before. She had balloons, cake, and even a magician who made scars appear out of nowhere. Surely she would come. Ethan shuffled toward her, arm-aching as he steadied his weight and offered one of the glittery cards. "It's going to be at the aquarium," he explained, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Dad rented the whole place, just for us." Madison hesitated, eyes darting to the small group of girls whispering behind her. She looked back at Ethan, then quickly shoved her hands into her pockets. "Sorry, I'm busy this weekend," she murmured, before scurrying away. Each rejection piled up like invisible weights pressing against his chest. By the time the bell rang for lunch, Ethan hadn't handed out a single invitation. He could already imagine the hollow echo of his birthday at the aquarium. Tables covered in untouched food, chairs lined up in silence. His father, Richard Miller, had promised it would be the best party anyone in second grade had ever seen. He'd ordered the invitations custom-made, arranged for private dolphin shows, even hired photographers. Richard believed money could fix anything, buildings, reputations, even loneliness. But Ethan knew something his father didn't. You couldn't buy friendship. The thought stung as Ethan shuffled toward the cafeteria, arms aching from the crutches. His legs stiff with the effort. Then it happened. His right crutch caught on. The loop of a backpack left in the middle of the hallway. Time slowed. His body pitched forward, the stack of invitations exploding into the air like startled birds. The heart flow rushed up and slammed against him, his crutches clattering to the ground. A sharp pain shot through his knee, but worse was the sound. The burst of laughter from a group of boys nearby. "Look, the robot broke down." One of them jeered. The others doubled over, snickering, pointing, as Ethan lay sprawled on the tiles. His face burned hot, tears already stinging his eyes, blurring the cruel blur of sneakers and smirks above him. He had fallen before, countless times, but never like this. Never with his hopes scattered around him, invitations trampled beneath careless shoes. He pressed his palms against the floor, trying to push himself up, but his arms shook with the effort, his humiliation heavier than the weight of his body. In that moment, it felt final, as if no one would ever want to come, no one would ever stand beside him. The laughter filled the hallway, echoing louder than any bell. Ethan's chest tightened, his throat locked, and for the first time, he wished he had never asked at all. The laughter still echoed in Ethan's ears long after it faded into the hum of the cafeteria. He stayed on the cold tile for a moment, longer than he needed to. Not because he couldn't get up, but because something inside him didn't want to try anymore. His hands trembled as he reached for his crutches, shame pooling in his chest. When he noticed movement beside him, a pair of worn sneakers stopped just inches away from the fallen invitations. They weren't new like the other kids' shoes. The white was faded into gray. The laces frayed and knotted so many times that they looked like they could snap at any moment. Ethan blinked through his tears, expecting another cruel smirk, another mocking word. Instead, a soft voice cut through the chaos. "Are you okay?" The voice didn't sound like pity. It sounded real. Ethan turned his head and saw Emma Thompson, kneeling beside him. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes carried something stronger than a smile. Concern. and a strange kind of strength that seemed far too big for a girl her size. Emma was the girl no one talked to unless they wanted to tease. She wore the same 3 outfits each week, hand-me-downs with fading colors and stitching loose at the seams. The other kids called her Food Stamp Emma when the teachers weren't around, their voices laced with the same cruelty they had used against Ethan moments ago. But Emma didn't seem to hear them, or maybe she was just used to it. Without waiting for him to answer, Emma began gathering the scattered invitations. She smoothed their bent edges carefully, her fingers lingering on the holographic fish that shimmered in the light. "These are really cool," she said, her tone full of awe, not mockery. "They look like they're actually swimming." She picked up another, her eyes wide, as if the invitation itself was magical. Ethan stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing, when she handed him his crutches. She steadied him with surprising strength. He pushed himself upright, shaky but standing, and met her gaze. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't let go of the invitations immediately. She glanced down at the top one, her lips pressing together as though she was holding back a question. Finally, she looked up again. "Is this your birthday party?" Ethan felt his stomach twist. He nodded, bracing himself for another rejection. He had heard it too many times that morning. But Emma's face didn't harden or turn away. Instead, it lit up. "At the aquarium?" she asked, her voice rising with excitement. "I've never been to one, but I've seen pictures and books, with all the fish and the glass tunnels where you can walk through and it looks like the ocean is all around you." Her words tumbled out, quick and breathless. And for the first time that day, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth twitch into a smile. Emma hesitated, her excitement dimming as self-consciousness crept in. "Could I come?" she asked softly. "I mean, if you have an extra invitation." Ethan's chest tightened, not with shame this time, but with something he hadn't felt all morning. Hope. Slowly, with hands still trembling, he pulled one invitation from the stack. He chose the least crumpled one, smoothing it out with care. His voice quivered as he held it toward her. "I saved the best one for you," he said. For a second, silence hung between them, but it wasn't heavy like the silence of rejection. It was full of something new, something fragile. Emma's face broke into a smile so wide it pushed back every shadow of the hallway. She took the invitation as though it were made of gold. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. From down the hall, the boys who had laughed at Ethan earlier stopped to stare. Their expressions flickered with confusion, maybe even a hint of discomfort. They didn't understand why Emma, the poorest, quietest girl in class, would bother with Ethan. But Emma didn't care. She turned back to him, her eyes shining. "I'll be there," she said firmly, like it was a promise carved into stone. Ethan felt something shift inside him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't invisible. Someone wanted to come. Someone wanted him, and what neither of them knew was that this single moment, born out of humiliation and kindness, would ripple far beyond the walls of that school hallway. It would change Ethan's life, Emma's future, and even crack open the heart of Richard Miller, the man who believed the world ran on money, because sometimes it only takes one yes to shatter 1,000 no's. Richard Miller stood at the window of his corner office, 32 floors above Boston Harbor. But the sweeping view of sunlight scattering across the water brought him no peace. Ships drifted lazily, gulls wheeled in the distance, and the city pulsed with the rhythm of commerce. It was the kind of view most men would kill for, the prize of decades of ambition. Yet for Richard, it was only a reminder of how much higher he had climbed than anyone else, and how much emptier it felt, up here, alone. The office itself looked more like a museum than a workplace. Glass walls gleamed. Shelves displayed awards from real estate magazines, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the room like a throne. But Richard rarely sat at it. He preferred the window, standing tall, arms folded, as if staring long enough at the harbor might distract him from the hollowness pressing at his ribs. Karen, his assistant, hovered at the door, clutching a folder of appointments. She cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Miller, Dr. Lavigne's office called. They could see Ethan tomorrow at 2 p.m. instead of next month." Richard turned his head slightly. "Clear my schedule." Karen hesitated. "Sir, the Shanghai investors." "I said clear it." His voice was low but sharp, the kind that silenced negotiation. She nodded quickly, retreating without another word. When the door clicked shut, Richard pressed his palm against the cold glass, his reflection staring back at him, a man in his early 40s, jaw sharp, hair perfectly styled, suit tailored to perfection. To the world, he was Boston's real estate titan, a man who could turn empty lots into skyscrapers and failing neighborhoods into luxury districts. To Ethan, he was dad. To Jessica, the thought caught in his chest like broken glass. He still couldn't say her name without feeling the echo of loss. 7 years ago, they had been happy. Jessica had been 6 months pregnant, glowing with that quiet joy only mothers carry. He had just closed his company's biggest deal, a Beacon Hill townhouse Jessica adored. They had stood in the kitchen with paint swatches, laughing over whether the nursery should be yellow or green. They had been invincible. Then came the delivery, the complications, the oxygen deprivation. Doctors with solemn eyes speaking words Richard barely remembered now, except for one, cerebral palsy. At 18 months, Ethan was diagnosed, and the future they had imagined crumbled into something unfamiliar, filled with therapies, specialists, and quiet hospital waiting rooms. Jessica never forgave herself, though every doctor told her it wasn't her fault. Richard remembered the way her smile faded day by day until she barely spoke. He threw himself into work, convinced he could hold them all together with money and determination, but one afternoon, he came home to silence. Jessica was gone, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter. "He deserves better than what I've given him." Richard had burned the note, but the words carved themselves into him. He swore Ethan would never feel unwanted again. He bought the best doctors, tutors, equipment, whatever his son might need. If Ethan wanted to swim, Richard built him a pool. If he wanted books, Richard bought the whole series. If a birthday party could give him friends, then Richard would rent the entire aquarium. But even as he signed the checks, a whisper haunted him. Money could not buy love. He pressed his forehead against the glass now, eyes burning. Earlier that morning, Ethan had begged him to let him hand out the invitations himself. Richard had almost said no. He could have mailed them, called the parents, or paid for RSVPs. But Ethan had wanted to be like the other kids, to walk into school and invite them with his own voice. Richard had nodded, proud of his son's courage, but inside he had feared what might happen. And now, as the harbor shimmered beneath the setting sun, Richard felt a chill move through him. He knew Ethan's classmates. He knew how children could be cruel without even realizing. What if no one came? What if his son's eyes, so full of hope, shattered in front of him? He clenched his fist against the glass, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he couldn't control. His phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a text from Karen. Final RSVP count for Ethan's party still 0. Richard's chest tightened. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, but the silence in the room pressed down like a weight. He thought of Ethan sitting alone with his stack of invitations, small hands clutching them as though they could hold the world together. A memory struck him so vividly. He had to grip the window ledge for balance. Ethan at 5 years old, sitting on the edge of the bed with tears in his eyes after a failed playdate. "Dad," he had whispered, "why don't they like me?" Richard had pulled him close, smoothed his hair, and promised, "They will, someday. I'll make sure of it." But what if that someday never came? Outside, the city kept moving, deals closed, lives rushed, fortunes rose and fell. Yet inside Richard's office, time stalled, trapping him in the echo of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He straightened at last, shoulders rigid. He had built an empire from nothing. He would not let his son's world collapse over an empty birthday party. If no child came, he would fill the aquarium with staff, performers, strangers if he had to. Ethan would not sit in silence. Not again. Still, beneath the steel of his resolve, a sliver of fear remained. Money had always answered him. But tomorrow, when the doors of that aquarium opened, he would face a question no contract could fix. What if Ethan's heart demanded something money could never buy? The aquarium glowed like a cathedral of glass and water. Tanks stretched toward the ceiling, casting shifting waves of blue light that rippled across the polished marble floor. A staff of 20 moved quietly around the space, hired for the evening to serve, to entertain, to make this night perfect. Tables groaned under the weight of food, chocolate fountains, shrimp cocktails, cakes with sugar coral reefs, balloons shaped like dolphins bobbed overhead, tethered to chairs that stood waiting. 25 of them arranged in neat rows, and at the center of it all sat Ethan Miller in his wheelchair, a paper party hat perched on his head, his small hands gripping the armrests as if holding himself together by sheer force. Richard stood near the entrance, his watch glinting under the aquarium lights. He had spared no expense. A private showing of the dolphin performance. Divers in costumes ready to swim behind the glass. Photographers waiting to capture smiles. Everything had been planned down to the minute, except for the one thing he couldn't plan. The guests. 7 o'clock came and went. The staff began shifting uncomfortably, glancing toward the doors. Ethan's eyes darted to the entrance every time the glass doors opened. But it was always another server, another staff member, no classmates. At 7:15, the dolphin trainer came over, asking if they should begin. Richard waved him off, his jaw tightening. "Well, wait." Ethan's shoulders slumped slightly, though he tried to mask it. "Maybe they're late," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice was careful, brittle, the kind of tone a child used when they didn't want to break completely in front of a parent. At 7:30, one of the photographers leaned down and whispered, "Shall we at least get a few shots of him with the decorations, just in case?" Richard's glare silenced him. By 7:45, the tables of food remained untouched, the chocolate fountain flowing like a cruel joke. The balloon swayed lazily in the air-conditioned draft. The only sound was the muffled thrum of the water pumps. Behind the tanks, Richard clenched his fists so tightly that the veins stood out in his hands. His mind screamed at him to do something, to pick up the phone, to pay someone, anyone, to walk through that door and fill a seat. But then he looked at Ethan, and the thought died in his throat. His son deserved real laughter, not hired smiles. Ethan stared at the empty chairs, the silence pressing harder with each tick of the clock. Finally, he looked down at his lap. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling, "we can go home. Just you and me." Richard swallowed hard, his heart twisting. He wanted to tell him no, that people would come, that he had just seen the RSVP list wrong. But the words wouldn't form. He moved toward his son, already signaling to the staff to begin wrapping things up. The sting of failure was sharp, like acid in his veins. Then, just as Richard reached Ethan's side, a voice cut through the aquarium's hollow silence. Wait, it wasn't loud, but it carried. Richard froze. Ethan's head snapped up, and there, standing in the wide glass doorway, was Emma Thompson. She was dressed in a faded pink dress, clearly borrowed and 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a piece of ribbon. Her hair had been brushed, but not styled, and she wore no glittering accessories like the other girls in Ethan's class. She held the invitation to her chest like it was the most precious possession she owned. For a moment, Richard simply stared, caught between disbelief and relief. And Ethan's face lit up with a joy so bright it outshone every tank, every light, every dollar Richard had spent. Emma stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, and smiled at Ethan. "I told you I'd be here," she said simply. The aquarium staff, unsure of what to do, fell silent. The photographers lowered their cameras. Even the dolphins behind the glass seemed to pause, circling in quiet spirals. The air shifted, charged with something Richard hadn't felt in years: hope, raw and undeniable. And in that moment, Richard understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. All the money, all the glitter, all the spectacle meant nothing. What his son needed had just walked through the door in a second-hand dress and worn out sneakers. Ethan's laughter rang out then, the kind of pure, unguarded laughter that had been missing from their home for too long. It echoed off the glass, filling the empty hall with something money could never buy: belonging. Richard felt his knees weaken as emotion surged through him. Jessica's ghost whispered at the edges of his memory, "He deserves better." For the first time, Richard began to believe that maybe better had finally arrived. The aquarium transformed that night, not because of the expensive lighting or the private exhibits, but because of the sound of 2 children laughing together for the first time. Ethan and Emma walked side by side, Ethan maneuvering with his crutches, Emma holding his pace with quiet patience as they entered the first glass tunnel. Above them, schools of silverfish moved in a synchronized wave, their bodies flashing like liquid mirrors. The tunnel curved ahead, bathed in shifting blues and greens that made the floor itself shimmer as though they were walking on the ocean skin. Ethan had been here before, more times than he could count, but tonight felt different. Usually, he trailed beside his father in silence, letting the beauty of the fish distract him from the loneliness pressing on his chest. But now, with Emma gasping at each new creature and tugging gently on his sleeve to point things out, the place came, alive in ways he had never noticed. She pressed her face to the glass, hands splayed out as a stingray glided overhead. "It looks like it's flying," she whispered, wonder thick in her voice. Richard stood a few steps behind, his tailored suit stiff against the glow of the tanks. But he didn't care. For years, he had watched his son move through life with a guarded quietness, a silence that grew heavier with every rejection. Tonight, for the first time, Ethan's silence was broken. He laughed, an unsteady laugh at first, but then freer, brighter as Emma pointed out a shark and whispered, "He's smiling at you." Ethan laughed so hard he nearly tipped sideways, and Emma instinctively grabbed his arm to steady him. The simple gesture carried more meaning than all the careful hands of therapists and nurses combined. They stopped at a tank filled with jellyfish, their translucent bodies pulsing like lanterns in the dark water. Emma's eyes glowed as she whispered facts she had memorized from a library book. "Did you know jellyfish don't have hearts? They just float and glow. My teacher said they've been alive longer than dinosaurs." Ethan listened, wide-eyed, as though she were revealing secrets of another universe. "You sound like you live here," he teased. Emma smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I wish I could. My mom says someday we'll go to a place like this, but we never have the money." She shrugged, but Ethan heard something behind the shrug, something heavy, something he knew all too well. Richard's chest tightened as he watched them. He was far enough to remain unseen, but close enough to hear fragments of their words. The way Emma spoke, the way Ethan responded, it was as if they had been waiting their whole lives to find each other. He thought of Jessica, of her absence, of the note she had left. He deserves better. And here was Emma, poor and overlooked, giving Ethan what neither money nor Richard's love could give, belonging. Suspense lingered in Richard's thoughts. Could this last? Or would Emma, like the other children, eventually turn away once the novelty wore off? He had seen enough betrayal, enough abandonment, to know how fragile hope was, and yet, watching his son's smile stretch wider with every step, Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. The evening pressed forward. The dolphin trainer finally approached, hesitant. "Would you like us to start the show? It's almost closing time." Richard started to wave him off again, but Ethan looked up at Emma, eyes pleading. "Do you want to see it?" he asked her. Emma nodded so fiercely her hair bounced. And so, the trainer gave the signal. Within moments, the glass walls erupted with movement as the dolphin swam past. Twisting and leaping in synchronized arcs, Ethan clapped as best he could, awkward and uneven. But Emma's cheers filled the space with a brightness that made up for every missing guest. The dolphins flipped higher, splashing against the glass, and Ethan laughed until his cheeks hurt. Richard's throat closed as he watched. All the grandeur, the money, the staff. It had taken just one child, one voice, to unlock his son's laughter. And Richard knew, with a clarity that struck deep, this girl had done more in an hour than he had managed in 7 years. When the show ended, Emma turned to Ethan and whispered, "Best party I've ever been to." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from gratitude. Richard stepped forward at last, his voice softer than he remembered it could be. "Emma," he said, drawing her attention. She froze, unsure, her hand still clutching Ethan's. Richard crouched slightly, lowering himself to their level. "Thank you for coming." Emma blinked at him, wide-eyed, like no adult had ever thanked her for anything before. "He invited me," she said quietly, "and I wanted to." Her words, so simple and so true, hit Richard harder than any investor's rejection, any lost deal, any sleepless night. He realized then that this moment, this bond, was the real gift. Not the aquarium, not the dolphins, not the glittering invitations. Just this, but deep inside him, a question coiled like a shadow. Could he, a man who had built walls out of wealth, open his world to a girl from nothing? And if he did, what would it cost them all? The night wasn't over, and Richard knew the most powerful moments had not yet come. Asterisk, the aquarium had gone. Quiet after the dolphin show, its wide halls echoing only with the hum of water pumps and the low, rhythmic swish of fish moving through glass. The staff had stepped back, unsure whether to keep bustling or to let the moment linger. For once, Richard Miller didn't care what they did. His focus was locked on his son and the little girl beside him. Ethan's face glowed, brighter than Richard had ever seen, as he and Emma leaned close to the glass, whispering and laughing as though the entire aquarium belonged only to them. Richard felt something stirring deep inside him, something that unsettled him more than $1 billion deal ever had. The realization that all his wealth had failed where this single child had succeeded. He had spent years chasing treatments, tutors, extravagant events, all meant to build Ethan a world of acceptance. But all it took was one girl with worn shoes and a borrowed dress to show him what he could never buy. Still, Richard was not a man who acted on emotion alone. Suspense gnawed at him. He needed to understand who this girl was. He needed to know why she came when no one else did. Why she looked at Ethan not with pity, but with joy. He waited until Ethan was distracted, pointing out a hammerhead shark that glided past. Before stepping closer to Emma, "You came tonight," Richard said, his voice low, almost cautious. When no one else did, Emma froze, her hand tightening. Around the edge of Ethan's chair, her eyes flickered up at him, wary, as though she expected to be scolded for intruding. "He invited me," she said simply, her voice steady but soft, "and I wanted to come." Richard studied her closely. She was small, her shoulders thin beneath the oversized dress. But there was a quiet strength in her posture. She didn't look away, even when most children would have. It was as though she had already learned that life was too hard to bow under every adult's gaze. "Your parents must have dropped you off," Richard pressed gently. "May I meet them? I'd like to thank them for letting you come." For the first time, Emma's expression faltered. She shook her head, strands of hair slipping loose from her ribbon. "My mom's working. She couldn't come." Richard frowned. "And your father?" asked her as she hesitated. "It's just Mom and me." Then, after a beat, she added, "She works 2 jobs. She wanted to be here, but she can't ever get time off." I walked. It took a while, but I didn't want to be late. Richard felt the weight of her words sinking to him. Walked through Boston at night. A 7-year-old girl in a hand-me-down dress had walked across the city because she refused to let Ethan down. "Does she know you're here?" Richard asked carefully. Emma nodded. "I left her a note. She'll find it when she gets home." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if this kind of arrangement was normal for her. Then she glanced at Ethan, who was still marveling at the shark tank, and whispered, "He looks so sad today. No one should be sad on their birthday. I didn't want him to be alone." The words cracked something inside Richard. He had built skyscrapers out of steel and glass, but this little girl had built something stronger out of nothing. Loyalty. Asterisk for a moment. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Richard thought of Jessica, her fragile smile, her final note. He deserves better. And for the first time, Richard wondered if better wasn't about wealth at all. It was about people like Emma. People who saw Ethan for who he was, not what he lacked. But then came the gnawing fear, the suspense that made Richard's chest tighten. What if this was fleeting? What if Emma's kindness was swallowed by the cruelty of her peers? The grind of her poverty, the endless hardships her mother faced. Richard knew the world well. He had crushed men twice his age in boardrooms, watched families evicted from buildings he redeveloped, seen loyalty turn to betrayal when money was on the line. Hope was fragile. Could Ethan survive if Emma disappeared as quickly as she had arrived? Ethan turned then, his small face bright with laughter. "Dad, Emma says jellyfish don't even have hearts. Can you believe that?" His excitement was so pure that Richard almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he crouched down, meeting his son's eyes. "Do you like having Emma here?" Ethan blinked, confused by the question. "Of course. She's my friend." He said it without hesitation, without the self-doubt that usually clung to his words. Friend. Richard hadn't heard Ethan use that word in years. The word echoed in Richard's mind long after Ethan turned back to the tank, and in that echo, a decision began to form. He couldn't let this end tonight. He couldn't let Emma drift back into her world of scarcity and struggle, while his son returned to loneliness. If money could not buy love, perhaps it could secure the chance for it to grow. Richard stood again, his expression unreadable as he watched the 2 children laugh together. He knew what he had to do, and yet, a sliver of doubt still twisted inside him, because what he was planning would not just change Ethan's life, it would change Emma's too. And once he made the choice, there would be no turning back. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second carrying him closer to a decision that would shock them all. Asterisk, the aquarium was closing. its great halls darkening one by one as staff began shutting down the exhibits. The dolphin tanks lay still now, their performers resting in the shadowy blue depths. The buffet tables, once gleaming with sugar wreaths and silver trays, stood untouched. Only 3 plates bore crumbs to from children and 1 from a father, who had barely tasted anything all night. The balloons bobbed warily above the empty chairs, reminders of the classmates who had never come. Yet in the center of it all sat Ethan and Emma, leaning close together, whispering, laughing softly as if none of that emptiness mattered anymore. Richard Miller stood a few steps back, his arms folded tightly, his expression unreadable. Inside, however, a storm churned. The silence of the empty hall reminded him of another silence years ago. The day he had come home and found Jessica gone, her final note scrawled on the counter. He had sworn his son would never be left alone again, never left unwanted, and yet here they were, in a hall of luxury, surrounded by empty chairs. It should have broken Ethan. Instead, one girl had mended what Richard could not. The photographer approached cautiously. "Mr. Miller, would you like a picture?" Maybe the 2 of them together. Richard hesitated. Normally, he avoided photographs that weren't perfectly staged. But tonight was different. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady. "One picture." The flash lit up the room, capturing Ethan's awkward but radiant smile beside Emma's wide grin. Richard stared at the image as it appeared on the screen. For years, he had collected photographs of his son surrounded by wealth, but alone. Tonight's photo told a different story. His son was no longer alone, and Richard knew that he could not let this moment end here. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the empty aquarium. "Ethan," he said, walking toward his son, "before we leave, I want you to open one more gift." Ethan blinked, confused. "But I already opened all of them." Richard crouched, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a white envelope. He held it out to Ethan, who took it slowly, his fingers trembling. "This one is special," Richard said, his eyes flickering toward Emma. "I saved it for last." Ethan tore the envelope open. Inside was a crisp sheet of paper, heavy and official, with a skull crest at the top. His brow furrowed as he tried to read the words. Then he looked up at his father. Richard turned to Emma. "It's for you." Emma's mouth fell open. "For me?" Richard nodded. "A scholarship, full tuition to Brookside Academy, starting next term. And your mother will receive financial support for her medical bills and living expenses. She won't have to work 2 jobs anymore." The words landed like thunder in the quiet hall. Emma's face went pale, her small hands clutching the invitation she had carried all night. "Why?" she whispered, almost afraid to believe it. Richard's gaze softened, the sharp lines of his face blurring into something more human. "Because you came when no one else did. You gave my son what I couldn't buy, hope. And I won't let that go." Ethan's eyes widened as he looked at Emma, then at his father. "Does that mean she'll be with me at school every day?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "From now on, you're not just Ethan's friend. You're family." Emma's breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at the paper, then back, up at Ethan. Slowly, almost timidly, she reached for his hand. Ethan squeezed it, his smile trembling but bright. "I finally have someone who wanted to come," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. The words shattered Richard's composure. He turned slightly, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. For years, he had built towers of steel and glass, but tonight, in this darkened aquarium, a 7-year-old girl had built something far stronger, a bridge to his son's heart. The staff stood frozen, their silence respectful, as if they understood they were witnessing something sacred. Even the dolphin seemed to stir, breaking the water's surface in gentle arcs, as though the whole world paused to acknowledge what had just happened. Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, then looked at Emma with a steadiness that left no doubt. "Jessica once wrote that Ethan deserved better. Tonight, I think I finally understand what she meant. Better wasn't about money. It was about this. About you." Emma blinked through her tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Richard replied softly, and she did not with words, but with a smile so wide it lit the hall brighter than any chandelier. Ethan pulled her close, laughing through his tears. "Best birthday ever," he whispered. Richard straightened, his chest heavy, but lighter than it had been in years. For the first time since Jessica's death, he allowed himself to believe in a future that wasn't built on deals or towers, but on something far more fragile and far more enduring: love freely given. The night ended not with applause, not with grandeur, but with a quiet promise spoken in the simplest of ways. And though the world outside went on with its noise and indifference, inside the aquarium a miracle had unfolded. One poor girl's yes had changed everything.